Thank you very much for inviting me and everyone to be here today. And I'm really excited to be here and pleased to be here. I know Vancouver very well because I actually lived in Vancouver for 20 years. And I was going to the temple in Steveston. So I've never actually had the opportunity to come to this temple, so I'm really glad to be here and to meet everyone. I hope to have a chance to talk to everyone later today. As Sensei mentioned, I'm actually in transition right now. I'm moving to New Zealand, and because I spent so long here, my family here, my wife and I, we decided we would spend a week in Vancouver before making our final trek to New Zealand. So I'm glad that I had a chance to come by and still visit. And taking off from that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself and my background with Buddhism and neuroscience. It was while I was here in Vancouver as a teenager that I fell in love with Buddhism. I had at home a lot of books on Buddhism that my father had, and I remember reading them as a young boy. And when I read them, they really resonated with me, and I instantly thought, yes, that's right, this is the way it is. At least this is the way I feel like life is. And I fell in love with Buddhism as a young boy. It was only until I went on a high school field trip where we went to check out the different temples and churches and synagogues around Vancouver that we went to the Steveston Temple. And that's when I first saw a real Buddhist temple, and I walked in and I smelt the incense and I saw the imagery, and I was like, yes, there is a place where I could go and not just self-study like I've been doing for so long. And that's how I got into Shin Buddhism, and I was a regular member of their temple for many years before I moved to Toronto in 2001 to start my graduate studies in cognitive neuroscience. And as a cognitive neuroscientist, I instantly saw that Buddhism and psychology and neuroscience actually have a lot in common. But I kind of compartmentalized my minds about it. I just thought, well, Buddhism is my life here, and neuroscience is my life there. And typical neuroscientists, we don't usually like to talk about anything that sort of whiffs of religion. It's just a science, and we want to stick to that. But that really changed for me in 2005. And in 2005, I attended a conference for the Society of Neuroscience. The Society of Neuroscience is the largest organization for neuroscientists and psychologists around the world dedicated to studying the brain. And this particular conference in 2005 was in Washington, D.C. What you see here is a picture, just one little part of the convention center that holds this conference. So you can imagine actually about if I would take 5 photos like this side by side, that's how massive this is. And it's so big that there's 30,000 neuroscientists across the world that come all around the world to this conference every year. So what you see here are just rows upon rows upon rows of other neuroscientists presenting their work by, in this case, posters to other neuroscientists. So it's a massive, massive event. And in 2005, our very special guest speaker was the Dalai Lama. And you might have heard about this in the news. It's been a while ago now. And I was thrilled when I heard that he was coming. And I really was kind of wondering just how this was going to go down with my other colleagues in neuroscience. As I said, when you talk to other academics and in the sciences, when anything that kind of whiffs of a religion, they get kind of antsy about. So I was really curious to see how this was going to be received. And this is actually a picture from one of the overflow rooms. It seemed like the whole conference came down to see him. He was very, very popular talk. And so I kind of snapped this photo of the overflow room that I was in, and you see I was just able to watch him on the screen. Now his main thesis of his talk, he was actually promoting sort of like his book that was published around the time, The Universe in a Single Atom. His main thesis was that science and Buddhism don't have to compete, like you might hear about a lot of times with the Christian church and science. That in fact, the ultimate goal of Buddhism and science is the same thing. We want to see reality for what it really is. And they both follow similar methods, that in the scientific method we test what our theories. We actually go out there and viciously test them. And if they hold up, then we go, okay, that's probably true. But at any time that we have any evidence to suggest that it isn't, it's thrown out. And just as the Dalai Lama said, that's true for Buddhism. You do what works for you, but you test it. You don't just accept it. So I was thrilled about this talk, and I thought it went down very well. But I was still very curious about my other colleagues in neuroscience. I just thought, they're a tough crowd, when you bring in someone like the Dalai Lama. There were some people that actually did object to him coming to the conference. Not many, but there were a few hundred out of the 30,000 neuroscientists that had a petition against him. But I kind of wondered how much of this talk really resonated with the other neuroscientists. And I was kind of doubtful that it really did resonate very well. But my mind changed again last fall when I went to the last conference for the Society of Neuroscience. So at all of these conferences, you have a whole row that's dedicated to publishers. And they put like the MIT Press, Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and they have these booths where they sell their academic books. And to my wife's chagrin, I always check it out, and I always buy tons of books. I'm carting them back home, and she goes, "How much money did you spend? You already got plenty of books, but I always go and I always get plenty, and I love getting books there. So I go to these booths all the time, and I look at sort of the different books on consciousness and emotion and memory, your typical standard neuroscience books. But this time, last fall, I found these books on Buddhism, meditation, and the brain. And particularly from this author, James Austin. He has these 3 books right here: Selfless Insight, Meditating Selflessly, and Zen in the Brain. I thought, wow, this is fantastic. These books right here at a neuroscience conference, I never would have believed that I'd see this. And there are tons of copies for each of these books. And then here's just a couple more. And what I'm going to do, if you are interested in any of these titles or anything of the actual papers that I talk about, usually I have an information sheet that I would hand out, but I'm kind of in transition, and all of my computer stuff is actually in a sea container between Winnipeg and New Zealand right now, so it's going to be a while. But I'm going to update my website as soon as I get down there, and I'll list some of these books and articles on the website for you. Here's another one that I saw: The Selfless Mind, Personality, Consciousness, and Nirvana in Early Buddhism. And this one by Owen Flanagan, The Bodhisattva's Brain. And I was so excited when I saw these books. I thought, this is fantastic. I'm going to get these books. But at the time, I only had enough money in my wallet for one. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to buy this one. And I'm going to come back the next day, and I'm going to get those other books that I just showed you. And there's tons of copies for each, so there should be absolutely no problem. So I bought this one, went back to the hotel, started reading it at night. Next day I went back, and to my absolute surprise, they were all sold out. I was absolutely shocked. I was dismayed, of course, because now I have to buy them online and pay the full price. But I was excited and happy too, because I thought, wow, these other neuroscientists, they didn't just scoff at it. They actually took it seriously. They actually are people who were interested in neuroscience. And I saw this as a hopeful thing, that it's growing among other neuroscientists and psychologists, that maybe, these authors that are talking about Buddhism, they have something to say, and it's something worthwhile. Now, this book is a great book, Owen Flanagan's The Bodhisattva's Brain. And the thesis of this book is that Buddhism and psychology share the same common goals, and that is to describe the nature of the mind, particularly for the purpose to alleviate suffering, mental suffering. But Buddhism psychology, they approach these problems from opposite directions. Buddhism is more about the personal, subjective approach, so particularly through meditation and introspection. Whereas in psychology, we take what we call more of a third-person approach to study cognition and study the mind and consciousness, where we depersonalize our subjects. I mean, even the term subjects, is sort of objectifying somebody. We're trying to quantify them. We don't really want to know how they feel most of the time. We just want to reduce everything to these numbers and quantify our data. And what Flanagan said was that, in fact, we could use both of these perspectives, a first-person personal perspective and a third-person perspective, and that Buddhism can influence psychology. And in fact, that has happened in the past before. And one of the best examples of how Buddhism has influenced psychology is a field of psychology known as humanistic psychology. And one of its principal creators or founders of this area of psychology, Carl Rogers. And he's best known for these two books, Client-Centered Therapy and On Becoming a Person. And Carl Rogers is a really interesting guy because when he was a young man, he actually wanted to be a Christian minister. And he went to China to attend a Christian conference. But it's kind of ironic that he went there and he got exposed to Buddhism, and when he came back, he didn't want to be a Christian minister anymore. He didn't quite become a Buddhist, but the Buddhist theory and doctrine resonated with him, and he used that to he used Buddhist theory in his version of psychology. So he's a principal creator of this field, humanistic psychology, that emphasizes that subjective, conscious experience of the individual. And according to Carl Rogers, human beings, we want to grow. We have this natural tendency to be better than what we are. So it's a very positive sort of type of psychology, which is very different in the 1950s than the psychology that was going on in the day, when we're looking at human beings as sort of machines that were just responding to stimuli. And there's nothing really going on in the brain. It was just, we're almost like automatic machines. So to just really briefly condense Carl Rogers' theory down, and I hope you could see this in the back, but I'll say it out. According to Rogers, all individuals live in this continually changing world of experience. And he called this the perceptual field. And this perceptual field we have is our reality. And so we all have our own personal reality. But then that doesn't discount that there's actually a real world out there. And when we discover that our perception of the world conflicts with reality, we have a distorted perception of what's really going on. And when this happens, then we have psychological tension and we have a psychological crisis. So for a really simple example, say you have this view of yourself as being an A+ student. And one day you get an exam back and you get a C. So the reality is the C. Your perception is that you're an A+ student. And that's incongruent with what you actually got. So this would cause the psychological tension. It would cause psychological crisis. The positive news is that we all have this basic tendency to want to strive to be better than what we think we are. We want to actualize, to resolve these psychological tensions. And when we do that, we're trying to see the world for really what it really is, to really see ourselves as we truly are. And when we do that, for Rogers, when we perceive the world truly as what it is, when we're more comfortable with ourselves, we actualize, and we're more accepting of ourselves, we're more understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Now, for those that are really have studied Buddhism for a long time and understand a lot of Buddhist theory, these different points in his theory should seem very familiar to you, because these are all basic Buddhist ideas. And what he's done is he's just taken Buddhist ideas and repackaged it so it sounds more academic and more accepting to the other psychologists in the day. So, for instance, the fact that we all live in this continually changing world of experience would be like one of the 3 marks of existence, impermanence. You know, the world is always changing, and our perception has to sort of keep up with it. The fact that our perceptions can be sometimes distorted and not actually match reality is like one of the 3 poisons. It's ignorance or deluded thinking or deluded view. When we have this, and we have this psychological incongruency, this causes psychological tension, or we call it maybe just suffering, dukkha. And when we try to get out of this, and we want to see ourselves and be more accepting of ourselves, I would say this is one way we could define an awakened state, nirvana. when we more are accepting of ourselves, we're more accepting of the world. We see now ourselves for who we truly are. So this is Carl Rogers, his way of repackaging Buddhist theory into a more academic sort of psychological terms that would be more palatable for the people in the field of psychology at the time. To take this just a further, Carl Rogers divided people into two broad camps. These maladjusted individuals that have this distorted perception. They deny reality. They distort it because they hang on to this ideal self or an ideal world that they hang on to and they always strive to be, but you could never actually achieve. And then these well-adjusted individuals that are more comfortable with their real selves. They know who they are, they're comfortable with it, with all the warts and all. And it's these people that are ready, as he calls, to actualize. And again, to actualize what he means, I think is one way we could sort of define what being an enlightened person or someone who's sort of achieved nirvana would be. Someone who's fulfilled their full potential, the be-all you can be, who is living in the moment, and is comfortable with the real self and not striving to be some ideal self that you could never really achieve in the first place. And just living in the here and now. So for Rogers, this theory that he constructed by borrowing ideas from Buddhism, this informed his way of psychotherapy. And his form of talk psychotherapy, what he called back then client-centered therapy, what we now call person-centered therapy, totally revolutionized psychotherapy back in the 1950s. Before that, it was dominated mostly, I would say, by Freudian kind of psychoanalysis. And therapist in psychoanalysis is someone who would be more directive, more instructive about what you should do and how you should think. For Rogers, in his version of psychotherapy, the therapist is more of a facilitator, someone who isn't there to tell you how to think or how to act. In fact, he goes out of his way not to. And you could see that for yourself. You can go to YouTube, and if you were to type in Gloria and Rogers, you will see this example of him giving this actual, real therapy session for this woman, Gloria, who had recently divorced from her husband, and she was suffering from depression and anxiety over meeting new men and how that's going to affect her young boys. And she was having a really rough time, and she had agreed to have one of these sessions videotaped, and you could watch it. It's a full 20 minutes. And during the session, she comes out sometimes and she says to Rogers, "What should I think? Tell me what, what's wrong, how I should fix it." And he says, "I wish I could tell you. I really wish I could tell you, but I really can't. You're the one that's living your life. You have to figure out how you should think about this." He's there to facilitate it, and he does that by these three qualities, and that's giving unconditional positive regard, or being completely non-judgmental in what she's saying, to help her foster congruency. That means to see herself as she really is and not hang on to these ideal versions of herself, like her ideal self that she has to be the perfect mother or has to be the perfect wife, and that's why her marriage went sour. To accept herself, warts and all, and to give unlimited empathy to the individual. And it's by these three qualities Rogers believed that people would find their path, and it would help them facilitate their growth and resolving these psychological tensions. Now, we're talking about psychotherapy, so you have a therapist that sits down with you and is talking with you and helping you resolve these goals. And sometimes when reading some of the sutras, it's almost as if you see the Buddha almost like he's conducting these sort of sessions himself, but instead he gives you a tool that you can take home with you. And I think that's what meditation is. For me, anyways, I view it as sort of like my own personal little form of psychotherapy. And so for that, I like to argue that in a way the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, was the first true psychotherapist. In fact, when you read some of the sutras, he's often referred to as a physician. He's someone that helped heal you. And I've taken two quotes of his that I think best make my point. It is a man's own mind, not his enemy, that lures him to evil ways. And we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. And that's a basic idea in psychology. So for me, the Buddha's most basic, most important insight was the problems, the suffering, the problems we're having in the world is by our way of thinking. And if we just reorient our way of thinking, we could sort of resolve a lot of this suffering or a lot of this mental anguish that we have. And that's what a psychotherapist does, is try to get you to sort of think in a different way. In fact, the very basic teachings of Buddhism that we all start off with when we learn Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, really this is a method that every modern day physician and psychotherapist follows. So as you probably very well know, the Four Noble Truths being the truth of dissatisfaction or suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering or dissatisfaction, dukkha, the truth of how to end suffering, and then the prescription for it, the Eightfold Path. And we could take these Four Noble Truths and we could rewrite them in something that would be, I guess, more modern. And this is exactly what every doctor, as a physician or psychotherapist does. We diagnose the illness, we identify the causes to that, which is in this case attachment to harmful behavior. We identify how to get rid of the illness, and we implement the prescription. So the Four Noble Truths is the same kind of method that we still use today. Now, as I said, one of the tools that we use is meditation. And in fact, meditation now is being incorporated more and more into psychotherapy. So here's a review article, Clinical Psychology Review. It's a little off there, so I'll read it out. This is Loving Kindness and Compassion Meditation. Potential for psychological interventions. And this article, again, I'll post this on my website if you're interested in reading more about it. But psychotherapists are now seeing the benefits of meditation and incorporating it in their practice. And one great example of that is an area known as mindfulness cognitive behavioral therapy. And here's quite a few books that have come out recently on how mindfulness meditation is now being used in cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy is nothing new. It's been around for a long time. And it's a little bit more directive than the type of psychotherapy I was talking about earlier with client-centered. I'll give you a really simple example of cognitive behavioral therapy. In cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT as we call it, we use certain techniques to help a person suffering with a very specific sort of problem. Say phobias. If you have a fear of, say, spiders, we might use a technique known as systematic desensitization. So in this case, someone would come in, they would say, I'm freaked out about spiders. I can't stand spiders. I just go balmy when I see a spider. So we might do something like show a picture of a spider to the person, and they'll freak out and they'll get really nervous and anxious, but eventually they learn to accept it and calm down and use relaxation techniques to not react to it in such a negative way. And then we up the ante a little bit. So it's like, okay, you've got accustomed to this, doesn't freak you out anymore. Okay, here's a rubber spider. And then just kind of throw it at them or something. I guess you might not really throw it at them, but you might show it to them. And yeah, that would be kind of cruel, I guess, if you did that. But if you showed it to them, you say, you know, here's a rubber spider. And they kind of react again, and eventually they calm down. And we use these progressive steps. It's like, say, the next one would be a spider in a cage in the side of the room. And then to the point where they're actually holding the spider in their hand. It's very successful. And it's used a lot for phobias. That's called systematic desensitization. So that's a technique for cognitive behavioral therapy. Now we're using mindfulness meditation in that as well. And in mindfulness cognitive behavioral therapy, what we're trying to do is train the client or the patient to be more mindful of the thoughts and feelings. Don't try to avoid them. Don't try to escape them. Be actually more mindful of it. Think about it. But just don't judge it. Just accept it. And don't react to it. So what we're trying to do is get them from what we call a mind of doing where we react in these automatic sort of ways, knee-jerk reactions to fearful stimuli or things that make us angry, to a mind of being, where we feel it, we know it, we see it, we accept it, but we don't react to it. So for instance, you might be driving down Lougheed or on the 99s, someone cuts you off, and your first instinct would be, I want to slam on the horn and wave a couple of fingers at the guy. That's kind of the mind of doing. You just sort of do this knee-jerk reaction in response to the anger that you feel. Whereas with mindfulness cognitive behavioral therapy, we are aware of it. You don't deny it. You're angry, but you just don't react. There's a way to interrupt those automatic sort of responses. You just accept it, and you go, in about 5 minutes, this guy's going to be far down the highway. I'll never see this person again, and he won't have to sort of interrupt my life in that sort of way. So there's no point in hanging on to this anger. And it goes. It sounds a lot easier, actually. It really is. It does take some training, but that is the essence of mindfulness cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's something to practice. It's something that the client can take home with them, not have to just work on it in the office of the psychotherapist. They could take it home with them. You could practice it everywhere. And in fact, little by little, I try to incorporate that in my daily life. So just being aware of where you are at the present time and what's going on around you. So sometimes I've gotten into the habit of, when I come to a red light, I just try to just be mindful of where I am and stop thinking about what I got to do wherever I'm going or what's just happened to me because some guy cut me off. Just where am I right now? And it's these little sort of moments that just ground you and bring you back to the present day. Now that's all great, that we're seeing meditation now being moved more into psychotherapy, and it's been popular now with psychotherapists. But as a neuroscientist, what I want to do is I want to understand what is actually going on in the brain during meditation. After all, I'm a neuroscientist. I want to know what goes on. So it's great to see that there's more and more research that's going on out there studying expert meditators, the monks themselves, that have a lifetime of experience meditating. Here's an example of one. This is a Tibetan monk, and what he's wearing is what we call an EEG cap, if you haven't seen one of these before. Each of those little white dots, each one of those white dots is an electrode, and it's recording the electrical activity from the scalp, of the brain activity that's going on. So here's another example, right here. Here's another monk that's meditating as his brain waves are being recorded. And the neuroscientist that is best known for this kind of research is Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin. And the lucky guy, he's personal friends with the Dalai Lama, so he has this endless supply of monks that are coming to his lab, just constant. I wish I could have that kind of connection. These expert meditators, and he has been so successful with his research that at the University of Wisconsin, they have actually founded this center for investigating healthy minds, where Buddhists and psychologists get together, all about studying how we could design certain rehabilitation programs or preventative programs for maintaining proper mental health. And I got the website there for you to check it out later if you'd like. Again, I'll post that on my website as soon as I can when I get down to New Zealand. Here's actually a couple of pictures of Dr. Davidson as he's about to put one monk in what we call the MRI machine. And here's Dr. Davidson on another day actually giving the Dalai Lama a personal tour of his lab. Now, if you're not familiar with MRI, or what we call magnetic resonance imaging, I'll just give you a very brief intro of what it is. I won't get too technical because it's not necessary to get too technical, but you've probably seen one before or you've heard of one. It's used in pretty much a broad range of applications in medicine. In my case, we're about investigating the mind, the structure of the mind, the activity of the mind. But there's a lot of times you might have heard of like a hockey player that had a knee injury and they had to get an MRI done. It's a way to peer inside the body. So here's a MRI machine, It's got this sort of donut shape. The patient or the subject would lie on this sort of table with their head here. This is one person sort of demonstrating. And then they are slid right into that hole. So it's very tight. If you're claustrophobic, it's not really a good thing. I've been in there. It's a little freaky at first when you get slid in there, but it's completely safe. And it uses powerful magnets and radio frequencies to basically peer inside. And it takes these beautiful, hopefully you can see it back there, but I'll show you more, these beautiful 3D images of the inside of your body, in this case the brain. So here's a picture of the human brain. What the MRI machine does is it takes pictures at these different sort of levels. So it's basically taking these slices of your brain. So these are actual MRI scans of your brain at these different levels, like this. So going from the bottom up, exquisite pictures. But the great thing about MRI is not just that it takes these structural pictures, it also shows you the function of your brain. So it can also show where your brain is most active when you're performing some sort of task. So the activity is shown by these sort of heat maps here. Shows that in this case, this person was sitting performing a visual task. And when you perform a visual task, a lot of the activity is going on back here. This is where we process vision, in the back of the head. So you can sort of see that you have all this brain activity going on in the back of the head. And then we could take all this and we could put it all together again. And we could reconstruct it. So now we have a 3D model of the brain and the activity on it, just like those heat maps, showing where the activity is. So that's in basic sort of intro of what fMRI is. And here's an example of just some sample data of what goes on when we're meditating. This is just one slice. So this is the back of the brain. This is the front of the brain. And this is the heat map, shows the activity when someone's just sitting there in the machine, they're not doing anything. So you see this activity in the front of the brain. And it increases quite a bit, significantly, when they're actually engaged in meditation. And that's significant because in the front of the brain is where you do most of your higher order thinking, your complex thinking. Now, there's lots of different types of meditation. I want to just show you a few and what happens with the brain when people engage in these different forms of meditation. For instance, focused attention meditation. So, for instance, you might be meditating and focused on an image, maybe a flower you're looking at, or a picture of the Buddha, or you might be imagining this blue dot that's in front of you, just focused on that. You're trying to ignore everything else that's going on in your environment, or you might be reciting some mantra and you're just focused on that. You're not sort of thinking about anything else. In this study, what they showed was these expert meditators that have more than 10,000 hours of experience in meditation showed stronger and heightened activity in their brain than these novice, inexperienced meditators that have very little practice, just 20 or 30 hours of practice in this focused attention meditation. So with long-term practice, the brain is just now being used more. There's just more going on now with this form of meditation. You're actually turning on more parts of your brain when you practice this meditation for a long time. But what's really significant and really cool, I think, is that it doesn't go away when you stop meditating. So this is what the brain looks like during meditation. This is inexperienced brain. This is experienced. So you can see there's more activation that's going on, especially in the frontal part of the brain, where we do our higher order thinking, than the inexperienced meditators. Then they're told, okay, stop meditating. Just lay there and just don't do anything. And when they do that, that's what we call baseline. There's all these areas that turn off with the inexperienced meditators. But with the experienced meditators, there's very little change. There's still heightened activity in the brain, even when they're not engaged in meditation anymore. So long-term meditation leads to physical changes in the way the brain behaves. So it's sort of like you're programming your brain now. You reprogrammed it. And that goes for other forms of meditation as well, such as loving-kindness meditation. So loving-kindness meditation, at least the way I do it, and there's different forms, of course, but the way I do it is, I imagine sort of these concentric circles that go wider and wider. And the closest one is my nearest and dearest loved one. So I meditate and I sort of think about and cultivate those feelings of love that I have towards my loved ones, which is very easy to do because of my loved ones. So my wife, my family, my daughter. And then after a few moments of that, then you think about your friends, not best friends, just the friends that you can hang out, have a couple of beers with, I guess, watch the game, and but you feel the same feelings of love towards them as you do with your nearest and dearest. And then when you do that, then you think about your colleagues, and then when you do that, you think now more about the strangers that you've met on the street that you don't really know, but you still think of the same sort of loving, warm, fuzzy feelings you have like you do with your loved ones. And when you're really good, if you really can, you think about your enemies in the same way, which is sometimes a little hard, but that's the goal anyways. And that's the loving kindness meditation that I do, and in this case, that was done in this study here. So in this study, it's a little off, but what this is this is what the brain looks like when people are thinking about their children, their loved ones, but in this case their children, and in this case their romantic partners or their spouse. And you can see there's a great overlap in the terms of the areas of the brain that are active. You can barely see that one, that's there and there. So this is sort of like the love circuit of the brain, if you will. Well, when they've taken these expert meditators with loving kindness and put them in the machine and said, okay, now we want you to do this loving kindness meditation, you see again these areas of the brain that light up, that overlap significantly with these people that were actually thinking about their loved ones. So with loving kindness meditation, even though you're practicing it and you're thinking about other people other than your loved ones, it's activating those sort of love circuits, if you will, in the brain. And the same is true for compassion meditation. So when you try to focus on your feelings of sympathy and empathy towards those people who suffer and the wish of alleviating their suffering. In this study, subjects were first shown these pictures of people closing doors, car doors, either in an unsafe, like you got their finger stuck here, and a safe sort of manner. And when the subjects see something like this, where the person's closing the door on their fingers, it elicits this activity in their brain, which would be the same kind of activity that would go on your brain as if you had slammed the fingers on your own, slammed the door on your own fingers. So they call this the pain matrix. But the most important part is this part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is front and medial being close to the middle of your brain. And this part of the brain has been long time associated with feelings of empathy. And for those people who practice and are very experienced with compassion meditation, when they put them in the MRI machine and scan their brains during compassion meditation, you see this medial prefrontal activity again ramp up during this compassion meditation. Again, this area, the medial prefrontal cortex here, that's more dorsal and more ventral, so there's different parts of the medial prefrontal cortex, and you see this activity that overlaps very well when you actually are watching pictures of people closing the car door in an unsafe way, causing harm to themselves. And I discovered this quite recently. This is a recent study that showed the activity of the brain when someone is actually reciting the Nembutsu. So this is very relevant to our school of Buddhism. They took these Japanese meditators and they put them in the fMRI machine and they said, okay, I want you to either, in this time I want you to just recite the Nembutsu. So NamuAmidaButsu, NamuAmidaButsu. And then another task, I want you to recite some other sutra. And unfortunately, it doesn't say what sutra it was, but it wasn't the Nembutsu. Well, here's the brain activity when they're reciting the Nembutsu. Unfortunately, it's just grayscale photos. There's no color. This is actually a top view of the brain at these different levels. And it's fuzzy because they took all the participants in the study and they averaged their brains together so you get this fuzzy sort of look. The actual activity is shown by this sort of whiter light. I'll actually highlight it so you can see where the actual activity is. This is when they're reciting the Nembutsu. And this is when they're reciting this other sutra. And what's really interesting is that when they're reciting the Nembutsu, it's also the medial prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that is associated with compassion and empathy. So it's very interesting. I don't know exactly what these people were thinking when they were reciting the Nembutsu. They must have had something very specific in mind, I would imagine. But I thought this was, especially for our school of Buddhism, I thought that was very, very interesting. So what does this really tell us? When people are meditating, they're practicing compassion meditation or loving kindness meditation. Well, the way I see it, especially as being a neuroscientist, is that this is a mental exercise that you're doing with your brain. And you may not be sitting there right in front of a loved one when you're doing loving kindness meditation, but the very fact that it's causing those circuits in the brain that are associated with love and loving feelings to activate, to me is a way that we're sort of practicing those parts of our brain. We're practicing empathy when we're doing compassion meditation. So you're more likely to respond in that way when you're in a situation. For example, this is a common technique that sports athletes do, a technique known as visualization. So here's the racer just before his race. He's sitting there and he's visualizing the race. He's visualizing about every turn he's about to take, how he's going to pass his opponent, how he's going to race to the finish line first. He's just picturing it in his mind. And when athletes practice this visualization, there is significant improvement in their performance when they do this. But what goes on in the brain is you're actually also activating those parts of the brain that will be involved in performing the task, even though you're not doing it. So here's a brain scan of someone that was in the fMRI machine, and they were just asked to imagine that they are performing some sort of task with their hands, just a simple motor task going back and forth with their finger like this. And when they're not actually doing it, they're just imagining it. And when they do, you see these areas of the brain that we call the motor cortex light up. So the motor cortex is like rests like this, and it's the relay station from the brain to the muscles. It's the last place the brain processes motor information and goes, okay, muscles, do your thing. So even though you're not actually moving, they're lighting up. And then the scans down here is the activity that goes on when they were actually then performing the task. So just imagining it lights up these brain areas. And for me, that's like with what you do with meditation. You're there, you're focused on loving kindness, cultivating your feelings of empathy towards other people who suffer. The empathy parts of your brain light up, the love circuits, if you will, light up, and you're pre-programming yourself. And you're exercising those parts of the brain. Here's another great example, actually. This is expert piano players. Their brains, when they're listening to a Beethoven concerto, and when they're actually playing it. And these are non-musicians, so they have no experience with playing pianos. So this is when they're listening to that same piece, and when they're attempting to play with it, they're just sort of playing along with their fingers. Now, what's really interesting about this is that you see the activity that goes on with these expert piano players when they're just listening to it. It's almost as if they're actually playing it. Because with long-term practice, they've changed their brain. They've changed the way their brain has now behaves. And I think that's what meditation does. With long-term practice, you're changing the way your brain behaves. So now, those areas of the brain that are about, say, empathy or loving kindness are more likely to fire. And you're more likely to then think and behave in that way, because your brain has physically changed. And not just in terms of its activity, but also its structure. So there are a lot of studies that have come out recently that show structural changes to your brain. So here's a picture of the brain sort of cut up. And the brain really has two sort of basic layers. You might have heard of like gray matter and white matter. So your brain cells, the neurons, are this gray part of the brain, right on the surface. The white matter are all those fibers that connect the different parts and areas of the brain. The neurons, they send their signals through this gray matter to other parts. But really, your brain cells are resting on the surface. Well, it's an unfortunate thing about life is that when we grow, that thickness of that gray matter, our neurons, shrinks. We lose cells when we age. It's just the way it kind of goes. But I got some good news. Long-term meditators, these, in this case, Zen practicing meditators, don't show the same decline in this thickness of the brain. So this is thickness of the gray matter that's measured. That's in millimeters, so it's not very thick anyways to begin with, but this is thickness, and this is the age of the participants. The red dots represent people who don't meditate, and you see the typical sort of decline with age and the thickness of your gray matter. So you're losing cells as you age. The blue dots represent these expert Zen meditators, and you can see there's no change. So the structure of the brain stays near the same. You're using more of your brain, and the brain is like a muscle, and you got to exercise it, and meditation is a great way to do that. So as I said before, Buddhism and psychology share a common goal in trying to describe the nature of the mind and to alleviate mental suffering. But we approach it from different views. And just like you see with these studies with neuroscience, well, we're sort of quantifying our subjects. We're quantifying it by the thickness of the brain or the amount of activity. But to really know what's going on, we have to use a first-person account. When we pull the person out of the scanner, we got to go, so when you were doing that loving-kindness meditation, what were you thinking? How did it feel? And they don't do that in neuroscience because that's icky feelings, and we don't deal with that. We want numbers. We want hard stuff. And this is where I think Buddhism and psychology could really inform each other and where we could interact. And really, this first-person approach to psychology isn't anything new to psychology. In fact, that's how psychology first began. The fathers, we call it, modern and experimental psychology back in the 19th century, like Gustav Fechner, William Wundt, and William James, they were all interested in the subjective experience of the individual. They wanted to know how people really felt. Particularly William Wundt, right here. He was best known for a technique called introspection. And here's actually an example of his lab. I don't know exactly what he's doing to this guy. Looks a little frightening, but his basic approach was he wanted to understand the structure of the mind, the structure of consciousness, by getting you to basically introspect and report it. So he broke consciousness into these three sort of areas, these three groups of elements. So elements of perception, elements of ideas, and elements of emotion. So for instance, a very simple example would be, he would show you a lemon, and he would say, so what do you see when you see that lemon? Like, just tell me the experience. And you go, it's really yellow. It's really kind of bumpy. Okay, and he'd write all this down, and then he'd say, well, what's your ideas about it? You know, like, what do you think about when you look at a lemon? Well, I think about lemonade, quenching my thirst. And what's your feelings about it? Well, I'm pretty ambivalent to it, you know, or whatever. Whatever it would be, he would get you to report, and he would believe that all these reports can be used to construct a full, complete view of consciousness. And this idea of breaking consciousness and the self down into these groups is in keeping with Buddhist theory. So some of you might be familiar with this, the 5 skandhas, or the 5 aggregates. Basically, the function of the human mind can be broken into these 5 sort of areas. Form, the physical body, the physical world. Sensation, either your experience is either pleasant or neutral or unpleasant of what you're seeing. Your perception of it, so you recognize it, oh, that's a lemon. Your mental formation, your ideas, thoughts, and volitions about it, like what are you going to do about this lemon? And consciousness, which, depending on what I've read, could either be a metacognition, so sort of gathering all these processes together, or just simple awareness, depending on what source you read. But this idea, the 5 skandhas, anticipates modern psychology by 2,500 years. And I find that very interesting because this is something that came about not in an experimental kind of way like we do with modern psychology. Now, we don't really take this seriously anymore from William Wundt. Unfortunately, it went out of favor, and then it sort of disappeared. But we have another version of that, and that's the sort of classic cognitive psychology account of information processing. This is what we teach today. This is what I teach today when I teach my students cognition. That is, it's sort of like a box model of how information flows in the brain. First, we see a stimulus, like a lemon, and there's some early sensory processing of like constructing the parts of the lemon in your brain. We have this thing called attention that sort of directs our attention to the lemon or something else, and filters all this irrelevant information like street cars going on the street and that kind of thing. Perceptual processes that go on and interact with memory, going, oh, that's a lemon. I remember that lemon. Emotional processing, in the case of a lemon, you probably don't have much, but if it's a knife, it might be more emotional to you. Decision-making processes, and response selection. I'm going to make that into lemonade, and then you motor output, and then you act on it. Well, again, we can take these 5 skandhas, and we actually could find a nice, tight little overlap between these 5 skandhas and our box model. So form would be more like stimuli because it's the physical world. Sensation would probably interact with long-term memory and emotional processing. Perception is directly the same kind of perception that we talk about today in modern psychology. Mental formation would be more like decision-making or higher order thinking of it. And consciousness would be more like attention. It's a neat little tight overlap. And these are ideas that far anticipated modern-day psychology. In fact, we could even take this and overlay it with the brain. Because the brain is separated into these different sort of, loosely into these modules. Highly interactive, but loosely in these modules. So, as I mentioned before, the front of the brain is to do with high-order thinking. We got motor cortex. We have the back of the brain with visual processing. This would be where auditory processing is. This would be perceptual processes. But there's one important thing about those 5 skandhas that the Buddha said, is that you can never find yourself in any of those. They all act together. They're all interacting and integrative. Yourself isn't resting in just any one. You take one away and the whole thing collapses. And that is just like the brain. And that's now what we're beginning to realize more in neuroscience. Because for years people go, where's that I? Where's that me? Where's that self in the brain? And people would look for it and they couldn't find it. And that's because the brain is a massively interconnected machine. So here's a picture of the brain from the bottom view. This is an MRI image of all those different fibers, that white matter I was talking about, showing all the connections between the different brain areas. And then this is just a cartoon schematic of the different networks and nodes in the brain. And as you can see, the brain is so massively interconnected that you'll never find yourself in any one part, just like the 5 skandhas. It's working together as a single unit. And the self isn't there. It's not to be found anywhere in there. So just to close, and to summarize what I've been talking about today, Buddhism and science really is about the same thing. It's about telling us about how the world really is. And more specifically, Buddhism and neuropsychology presents a very deep, sophisticated analysis of the human mind and how it works. And they converge on this problem of how the mind works, but from opposite directions. And I think there's an opportunity for Buddhism and psychology to enter into a dialogue about its different approaches so we can better understand the mind. And I presented 3 different areas in which we can do that. The first is like psychotherapy, to alleviate mental suffering. And we've already seen evidence how Buddhism has actually been incorporated in psychotherapy through Rogers' humanistic psychology and meditation. The mental and physical benefits of meditation, which you see with the neuroscience studies, showing that the structure of the brain and the activity of the brain actually changes with experience. And then, of course, just in a more purely scientific kind of way, just a basic, pure understanding of the brain, and when we can understand the brain better, we understand ourselves better, we understand human nature better. One last bits of information you might be interested is this book here. This is a great book that came out recently by Alan Wallace, where he actually investigates Buddhism and neuroscience and how they converge together. That is going to be very much in line with what I talked about today. And if you'd like to know more information, and here's more evidence how psychology is now taking Buddhism more seriously, we have a program at the University of Toronto on Buddhism, psychology, and the mental health. There are several different examples here of how mindfulness cognitive behavioral therapy is being used today in psychotherapy, psychotherapy and meditation. This is a great website by buddhanet.net. And this was a great surprise to me because I'm going to New Zealand. New Zealand is a small country, so they don't have their own psychological society. They kind of just tag along with the Australians. So they usually, all the New Zealand's neuroscientists and psychologists there are just members of the Australian Psychological Society. And they have their own chapter or group called a group on Buddhism and psychology. So I'm very enthusiastic about joining that and again, seeing the sort of synergy that we can have between Buddhists and psychologists. Yeah, so thank you very much.
If anyone has any questions, I think we can take probably more than 2-3 people, but if you have any questions that you want to ask Dr. Prime, if you have no question, we go to... Yeah.
Are people beginning to involve some documentation of the subjective experience in an experimental setting?
It's been slow. And I mentioned Richard Davidson, who has been more proactive in doing neuroscience and meditation. And I've read lots of his papers. And unfortunately, he leaves that part out. And I think that's the new direction to go. And I think that's what we have to do. And I've argued for a long time with my neuroscience friends that the language of neuroscience is very limited. We can only talk in terms of this quantitative data with activations and where they are in the brain and how much. But that only tells us only so much. It's still an impoverished language. In order to fully understand the brain, we have to then go tap on the person's shoulder and say, hey, what were you thinking? Tell us your experience.
Maybe as just an open descriptor of their experience, you could just run through a story. Would that be, even within a word limit, something that could be included in a published document?
Oh, sure. Well, there's... It depends on how you do it, I suppose. You could have sort of a survey-based sort of questionnaire that the participant would just fill out, and they'd be like on like a 1 to 5, I felt really great, or that wasn't good for me, or something like that. And then you could use that. Or it could be something more of an open discourse, where it'd be like, describe this experience in your own language. In that kind of case, if you're familiar with academic papers, you know that it's always limited on space. So you'd have someone doing what's called a discourse analysis. And then they would sort of try to find those words that sort of pop out all the time, that seem most common among subjects, and then they would use that. Yeah. I see someone in the back there.
Come back to you.
Yeah, you were mentioning the MRI studies. I think it started in the 90s, and the first findings was kind of the laughing stuff at the scientific world, But it showed that this phenomena they call brain plasticity,
Mm-hmm, that's
the
right.
ability the brain to rewire itself and change. You can change your behavior, and I read lately that 99% of the brain capacity, which is all the interconnection, probably 140 billion, all the connection, it's trillions of billions. 99% of it overnight. The brain can create its own scenarios and rewire itself. I was reading about this woman who had an accident or illness. one half of her brain was damaged, so it's like people who are blind, they develop a sixth sense, you know. So she was kind of grateful that the part of her brain were active allowed her to experience mindfulness, you know. Mm-hmm. And she was very grateful for the accident. I took the notes. I couldn't find it. You mentioned like the basis of cognitive therapies. Your thoughts that are not you are. I think you mentioned that Buddhism is kind of the opposite. You are what your thoughts are.
I quoted from one of the quotes, popular quotes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'd just like to just follow up on that. I wonder if you're referring to the same person that I heard of. It was a neuroscientist who actually experienced a stroke. And she wrote a book called My Insight into... That's right. And she has this wonderful... You could go on YouTube and you could look up the TED lectures, and she gave it. And she described that it damaged that part of the brain that sort of... it sort of like collects, gathers, and filters her thoughts. It damaged that part. So now she seemed open to everything. In fact, she actually described it as feeling the sense of nirvana, because she had this wider sort of perceptual field. It was really quite a powerful talk. I recommend it to anybody. But yes, the brain previously was always thought static. What you've got at birth is what you got. But of course we know that's not true. The brain is incredibly plastic, and we call it neuroplasticity. And in the lab that I worked in at the University of Manitoba, we worked with stroke patients. And when you have stroke patients, one of the most common areas of the brain that are damaged by stroke is back here in the right parietal cortex, we call it. And when they have that stroke damage, they become typically unaware of the left side of their body, unaware of the left side of space. Most of the time that's only temporary, and it comes back because the brain is literally rewiring itself. It's finding other ways to heal it, to sort of bring back those capacities. And what we try to do at the University of Manitoba is try to develop new rehabilitation techniques to speed that rewiring up. And there's a fascinating story about a woman that was missing one whole hemisphere. She was born that way because she had a stroke when she was just prenatally before she was born, and it destroyed one hemisphere. But she never knew it until one day she went in as a subject for an MRI study. And the technicians thought there was something wrong. It was like, what's wrong with the scanner? It's only showing half of her brain, because there wasn't another brain there. But she's a perfectly normal, behaving, thinking individual. You would never know. She doesn't suffer from any obvious impairments at all. So to think that there are some parts of the brain that, on one side, that are specialized for a certain function. Like, for instance, there's what's called a face perception area. And if I remember my neuroscience is on the right hemisphere. And that's more predominantly right. It doesn't say there isn't one there left, but it's more predominantly right. And if that's damaged, it doesn't mean that you're totally now luckless about it. The brain has a way of rewiring it to sort of bring back those capacities. I think you had a question?
In Buddhism, in Zen, there's a lot of discussion of moments of enlightenment, right? Now, is there any scientific research that would describe that, or the effects of it?
Yes, there is actually. There's a lab from Laurentian University, Laurentian in Sudbury, Ontario. And they use a technique known as transcranial magnetic stimulation, a technique that I use as well, or TMS for short. And what we do with TMS is that we apply a magnetic field to a person's skull to activate parts of the brain or disrupt it, its normal function. And he's found an area of the brain that he termed the God area. But it's not to say that it's actually anything to do with God, a Christian God, but just this sort of area of the brain that seems to be active when people are experiencing sort of like a spiritual experience, or sometimes when people experience something that they think is like they feel like that woman with the neuroscientist with a stroke. They all of a sudden feel more in the present moment, more fully awake to the world. And so he's doing research on that. It's very controversial, but there is that one lab that I'm aware of.
Quick follow-up to that. Is that with the area turned off or activated?
That's with the area activated, right.
I have one more. Yeah.
Could you tell us the name of these two? Sorry, the name of this lady that had a stroke and the name of this researcher?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the nurse. Sorry?
Jill Taylor.
Jill. Oh, that's right. Jill Taylor. Yes, that's right.
And this
My
researcher?
stroke with good fortune, right?
My Insight into Stroke was the name of her book. Yeah. And I'll have to look up the name for the researcher in Laurentian. But I do remember it's Laurentian because I went up there to talk to him. But that was a few years ago.
Yeah, if I heard you correctly, you said that for experienced musicians, when they listen to music, they get the same benefit as playing the music while listening. I'm just curious. You know, you can pick up a number of books nowadays on how to listen to music critically, whether it be jazz or classical, whatever. If you can listen to music critically, would you get the same advantage as playing, even though you're not a trained musician at playing?
That's a good question. I'm not really too sure. I don't really know. My feeling is that without that actual experience, the actual you're not just sort of intellectually studying it, you're actually practicing it. I think it would come from that.
Okay.
I'm not a musician at all, but my wife is trained in it because she's in theater, and so I'm a big Beatles fan, and I bought these books that was supposed to really break Beatles music down into its meaning. And I thought it was going to be all sort of qualitative in the way it discussed it, but it wasn't. It was an actual forensic analysis of notes, and I didn't understand any of it. I didn't get anything out of it, and I just thought this is a disaster because I don't understand A sharp what really meant something in the middle of Revolver. I don't know. It's like I don't get it. But my wife understands it because she actually has that practice and she plays piano and she gets the notes, and no matter how much I try to read it, I could intellectually understand it now. That A means this, it means it's but I still can't really fully experience it the same way my wife does.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Prime.
Thank
once
you.
again.
Thank you.
Very
you very
fortunate
much.
to
Thank
have
you.
you here. Thank you.